It was inevitable that flight should obsess man on Venus, for the planet afforded but a cramping home for groundlings, and the riotous efflorescence of avian species shamed man's pedestrian habit. When in due course the sixth men attained knowledge and power comparable to that of the first men at their height, they invented flying machines of various types. Many times, indeed, mechanical flight was rediscovered and lost again with the downfall of civilization, but at its best it was regarded only as a makeshift. And when at length, with the advance of the biological sciences, the sixth men were in a position to influence the human organism itself, they determined to produce a true flying man. Many civilizations strove vainly for this result, sometimes half-heartedly, sometimes with religious earnestness. Finally, the most enduring and brilliant of all the civilizations of the sixth men actually attained the goal. The seventh men were pygmies, scarcely heavier than the largest of terrestrial flying birds. Through and through they were organized for flight. A leathery membrane spread from the foot to the tip of the immensely elongated and strengthened middle finger. The three outer fingers, equally elongated, served as ribs to the membrane, while the index and thumb remained free for manipulation. The body assumed the streamlines of a bird, and was covered with a deep quilt of feathery wool. This, and the silken down of the flight membranes, varied greatly from individual to individual in its coloring and texture. On the ground the seventh men walked much as other human beings, for the flight membranes were folded close to the legs and body, and hung from the arms like exaggerated sleeves. In flight the legs were held extended as a flattened tail, with the feet locked together by the big toes. The breastbone was greatly developed as a keel, and as a base for the muscles of flight. The other bones were hollow, for lightness, and their internal surfaces were utilized as supplementary lungs. For, like the birds, these flying men had to maintain a high rate of oxidation. A state which others would regard as fever was normal to them. Their brains were given ample tracks for the organization of prowess in flight. In fact, it was found possible to equip the species with a system of reflexes for aerial balance, and a true though artificial instinctive aptitude for flight and interest in flight. Compared with their makers, their brain volume was of necessity small, but their whole neural system was very carefully organized. Also, it matured rapidly, and was extremely facile in the acquirement of new modes of activity. This was very desirable, for the individual's natural life period was but 50 years, and in most cases it was deliberately cut short by some impossible feat at about 40, or whenever the symptoms of old age began to be felt. Of all human species, these bat-like flying men, the seventh men, were probably the most carefree. Gifted with harmonious physique and gay temperament, they came into a social heritage well adapted to their nature. There was no occasion for them, as there had often been for some others, to regard the world as fundamentally hostile to them, or themselves as essentially deformed. Of quick intelligence in respect of daily personal affairs and social organization, they were untroubled by the insatiable lust of understanding. Not that they were an unintellectual race, for they soon formed a beautifully systematic account of experience. They clearly perceived, however, that the perfect sphere of their thought was but a bubble adrift in chaos. Yet it was an elegant bubble, and the system was true, in its own gay and frankly insincere manner, true as significant metaphor, not literally true. What more, it was asked, could be expected of human intellect? Adolescents were encouraged to study the ancient problems of philosophy for no reason but to convince themselves of the futility of probing beyond the limits of the orthodox system. Prick the bubble of thought at any point, it was said, and you shatter the whole of it, and since thought is one of the necessities of human life, it must be preserved. Natural science was taken over from the earlier species with half-contemptuous gratitude as a necessary means of sane adjustment to the environment. Its practical applications were valued as the ground of the social order, but as the millennia advanced, and society approached that remarkable perfection and stability which was to endure for many million years, scientific inventiveness became less and less needful, and science itself was relegated to the infant schools. History was also given an outline during childhood, and subsequently ignored. This curiously sincere intellectual insincerity was due to the fact that the seventh men were chiefly concerned with matters other than abstract thought. It is difficult to give to members of the first human species an inkling of the great preoccupation of these flying men. To say that it was flight would be true, yet far less than the truth. To say that they sought to live dangerously and vividly, to crowd as much experience as possible into each moment, would again be a caricature of the truth. On the physical plane, indeed, the universe of flight, with all the variety of peril and skill afforded by a tempestuous atmosphere, was every individual's chief medium of self-expression. Yet it was not flight itself, but the spiritual aspect of flight which obsessed the species. In the air and on the ground, the seventh men were different beings. Whenever they exercised themselves in flight, they suffered a remarkable change of spirit. Much of their time had to be spent on the ground, since most of the work upon which civilization rested was impossible in the air. Moreover, life in the air was life at high pressure, and necessitated spells of recuperation on the ground. In their pedestrian phase, the seventh men were sober folk, mildly bored, yet in the main cheerful, humorously impatient of the drabness and irk of pedestrian affairs, but ever supported by memory and anticipation of the vivid life of the air. Often they were tired, after the strain of that other life, but seldom were they despondent or lazy. Indeed, in the routine of agriculture and industry, they were industrious as the wingless ants. Yet they worked in a strange mood of attentive absent-mindedness, for their hearts were ever in the air. So long as they could have frequent periods of aviation, they remained bland even on the ground. But if for any reason, such as illness, they were confined to the ground for a long period, they pined, developed acute melancholia, and died. Their makers had so contrived them that with the onset of any very great pain or misery their hearts should stop. Thus they were to avoid all serious distress. But in fact this merciful device worked only on the ground. In the air they assumed a very different and more heroic nature, which their makers had not foreseen, though indeed it was a natural consequence of their design. In the air the flying man's heart beat more powerfully. His temperature rose. His sensation became more vivid and more discriminate, his intelligence more agile and penetrating. He experienced a more intense pleasure or pain in all that happened to him. It would not be true to say that he became more emotional, rather the reverse, if by emotionality is meant enslavement to the emotions, for the most remarkable features of the aerial phase were that this enhanced power of appreciation was dispassionate. So long as the individual was in the air, whether in lonely struggle with the storm, or in the ceremonial ballet with sky-darkening hosts of his fellows, whether in the ecstatic love-dance with a sexual partner, or in solitary and meditative circlings far above the world, whether his enterprise was fortunate, or he found himself disheartened by the hurricane and crashing to death, always the gay and the tragic fortunes of his own person were regarded equally with detached aesthetic delight. Even when his dearest companion was mutilated or destroyed by some aerial disaster, he exulted, though also he would give his own life in the hopes of effecting a rescue. But very soon after he had returned to the ground, he would be overwhelmed with grief, would strive vainly to recapture the lost vision, and would perhaps die of heart failure. Even when, as happened occasionally in the wild climate of Venus, a whole aerial population was destroyed by some worldwide atmospheric tumult, the few broken survivors, so long as they could remain in the air, exulted, and actually, while at length they sank exhausted toward the ground, toward certain disillusionment and death, they laughed inwardly. Yet an hour after they had alighted, their constitution would be changed, their vision lost. They would remember only the horror of the disaster, and the memory would kill them. No wonder the seventh men grudged every moment that was passed on the ground. While they were in the air, of course, the prospect of a pedestrian interlude, or indeed of endless pedestrianism, though in a manner repugnant, would be accepted with unswerving gaiety. But while they were on the ground, they grudged bitterly to be there. Early in the career of this species, the proportion of aerial to terrestrial hours was increased by a biological invention. A minute food plant was produced which spent the winter rooted in the ground and the summer adrift in the sunlit upper air, engaged solely in photosynthesis. Henceforth the populations of the flying men were able to browse upon the bright pastures of the sky like swallows. As the ages passed, material civilization became more and more simplified. Needs which could not be satisfied without terrestrial labor tended to be outgrown. Manufactured articles became increasingly rare. Books were no longer written or read. In the main, indeed, they were no longer necessary, but to some extent their place was taken by verbal tradition and discussion in the upper air. Of the arts, music, spoken lyric and epic verse, and the supreme art of winged dance were constantly practiced. The rest vanished. Many of the sciences inevitably faded into tradition, yet the true scientific spirit was preserved in a very exact meteorology, a sufficient biology, and a human psychology surpassed only by the second and fifth species at their height. None of these sciences, however, was taken very seriously, save in its practical applications. For instance, psychology explained the ecstasy of flight very neatly as a febrile and irrational beatitude. But no one was disconcerted by this theory, for everyone, while on the wing, felt it to be merely an amusing half-truth. The social order of the seventh men was in essence neither utilitarian, nor humanistic, nor religious, but aesthetic. Every act and every institution were to be justified as contributing to the perfect form of the community. Even social prosperity was conceived as merely the medium in which beauty should be embodied, the beauty, namely, of vivid individual lives harmoniously related. Yet not only for the individual, but even for the race itself, so the wise insisted, death on the wing was more excellent than prolonged life on the ground. Better, far better, would be racial suicide than a future of pedestrianism. Yet though both the individual and the race were conceived as instrumental to objective beauty, there was nothing religious in any ordinary sense in this conviction. The seventh men were completely without interest in the universal and the unseen. The beauty which they sought to create was ephemeral and very largely sensuous, and they were well content that it should be so. Personal immortality, said a dying sage, would be as tedious as an endless song. Equally so with the race. The lovely flame, of which we are all members, must die, he said, must die, for without death she would fall short of beauty. For close on 100,000,000 terrestrial years this aerial society endured with little change. On many of the islands throughout this period stood even yet a number of the ancient pylons, though repaired almost beyond recognition. In these nests the men and women of the seventh species slept through the long Venerian nights, crowded like roosting swallows. By day the same great towers were sparsely peopled with those who were serving their turn in industry, while in the fields and on the sea others labored, but most were in the air. Many would be skimming the ocean, to plunge, gannet-like, for fish. Many, circling over land or sea, would now and again swoop like hawks upon the wild fowl which formed the chief meat of the species. Others, 40 or 50,000 feet above the waves, where even the plentiful atmosphere of Venus was scarcely capable of supporting them, would be soaring, circling, sweeping, for pure joy of flight. Others, in the calm sunshine of the high altitudes, would be hanging effortless upon some steady upcurrent of air for meditation and the rapture of mere percipience. Not a few love-intoxicated pairs would be entwining their courses in aerial patterns and spires, cascades, and true love-knots of flight, presently to embrace and drop 10,000 feet in bodily union. Some would be driving hither and thither through the green mists of vegetable particles, gathering the manna in their open mouths. Companies, circling together, would be discussing matters social or aesthetic. Others would be singing together, or listening to recitative epic verse. Thousands gathering in the sky like migratory birds would perform massed convolutions, reminiscent of the vast mechanical aerial choreography of the first world state, but more vital and expressive, as a bird's flight is more vital than the flight of any machine. And all the while there would be some, solitary or in companies, who, either in pursuit of fish and wildfowl, or out of pure devilment, pitted their strength and skill against the hurricane, often tragically, but never without zest and laughter of the spirit. It may seem to some incredible that the culture of the seventh men should have lasted so long. Surely it must either have decayed through mere monotony and stagnation, or have advanced into richer experience. But no, generation succeeded generation, and each was too short-lived to outlast its young delight and discover boredom. Moreover, so perfect was the adjustment of these beings to their world, that even if they had lived for centuries they would have felt no need of change. Flight provided them with intense physical exhilaration, and with the physical basis of a genuine and ecstatic, though limited, spiritual experience. In this, their supreme attainment, they rejoiced not only in the diversity of flight itself, but also in the perceived beauties of their variegated world, and most of all, perhaps, in the 1,000 lyric and epic ventures of human intercourse in an aerial community. The end of this seemingly everlasting Elysium was nevertheless involved in the very nature of the species. In the first place, as the ages lengthened into aeons, the generations preserved less and less of the ancient scientific lore, for it became insignificant to them. The aerial community had no need of it. The loss of mere information did not matter so long as their condition remained unaltered, but in due course biological changes began to undermine them. The species had always been prone to a certain biological instability. A proportion of infants, varying with circumstances, had always been misshapen, and the deformity had generally been such as to make flight impossible. The normal infant was able to fly early in its second year. If some accident prevented it from doing so, it invariably fell into a decline and died before its third year was past. But many of the deformed types, being the result of a partial reversion to the pedestrian nature, were able to live on indefinitely without flight. According to a merciful custom, these cripples had always to be destroyed, but at length, owing to the gradual exhaustion of a certain marine salt essential to the high-strung nature of the seventh men, infants were more often deformed than true to type. The world population declined so seriously that the organized aerial life of the community could no longer be carried on according to the time-honored aesthetic principles. No one knew how to check this racial decay, but many felt that with greater biological knowledge it might be avoided. A disastrous policy was now adopted. It was decided to spare a carefully selected proportion of the deformed infants, those namely which, though doomed to pedestrianism, were likely to develop high intelligence. Thus it was hoped to raise a specialized group of persons whose work should be biological research, untrammeled by the intoxication of flight. The brilliant cripples that resulted from this policy looked at existence from a new angle. Deprived of the supreme experience for which their fellows lived, envious of a bliss which they knew only by report, yet contemptuous of the naive mentality which cared for nothing, it seemed, but physical exercise, love-making, the beauty of nature, and the elegances of society, these flightless intelligences sought satisfaction almost wholly in the life of research and scientific control. At the best, however, they were a tortured and resentful race, for their natures were fashioned for the aerial life which they could not lead. Although they received from the winged folk just treatment and a certain compassionate respect, they writhed under this kindness, locked their hearts against all the orthodox values, and sought out new ideals. Within a few centuries they had rehabilitated the life of intellect, and, with the power that knowledge gives, they had made themselves masters of the world. The amiable flyers were surprised, perplexed, even pained, and yet withal amused, even when it became evident that the pedestrians were determined to create a new world order in which there would be no place for the beauties of natural flight. The flyers were only distressed while they were on the ground. The islands were becoming crowded with machinery and flightless industrialists. In the air itself, the winged folk found themselves outstripped by the base but effective instruments of mechanical flight. Wings became a laughing-stock, and the life of natural flight was condemned as a barren luxury. It was ordained that in future every flyer must serve the pedestrian world order or starve, and as the cultivation of wind-borne plants had been abandoned, and fishing and fowling rights were strictly controlled, this law was no empty form. At first it was impossible for the flyers to work on the ground for long hours, day after day, without incurring serious ill health and an early death. But the pedestrian physiologists invented a drug which preserved the poor wage slaves in something like physical health, and actually prolonged their life. No drug, however, could restore their spirit, for the normal aerial habit was reduced to a few tired hours of recreation once a week. Meanwhile, breeding experiments were undertaken to produce a wholly wingless, large-brained type, and finally a law was enacted by which all winged infants must either be mutilated or destroyed. At this point, the flyers made a heroic but ineffectual bid for power. They attacked the pedestrian population from the air. In reply, the enemy rode them down in his great aeroplanes and blew them to pieces with high explosive. The fighting squadrons of the natural flyers were finally driven to the ground in a remote and barren island. Thither the whole flying population, a mere remnant of its former strength, fled out of every civilized archipelago in search of freedom. The whole population, save the sick who committed suicide, and all infants that could not yet fly. These were stifled by their mothers or next of kin, in obedience to a decree of the leaders. About 1 million men, women, and children, some of whom were scarcely old enough for the prolonged flight, now gathered on the rocks, regardless that there was not enough food in the neighborhood for a great company. Their leaders, conferring together, saw clearly that the day of flying men was done, and that it would be more fitting for a high-souled race to die at once than to drag on in subjection to contemptuous masters. They therefore ordered the population to take part in an act of racial suicide that should at least make death a noble gesture of freedom. The people received the message while they were resting on the stony moorland. A wail of sorrow broke from them. It was checked by the speaker, who bade them to strive to see, even on the ground, the beauty of the thing that was to be done. They could not see it, but they knew that if they had the strength to take wing again, they would see it clearly, almost as soon as their tired muscles bore them aloft. There was no time to waste, for many were already faint with hunger and anxious lest they should fail to rise. At the appointed signal the whole population rose into the air with a deep roar of wings. Sorrow was left behind. Even the children, when their mothers explained what was to be done, accepted their fate with zest, though had they learned of it on the ground they would have been terror-stricken. The company now flew steadily west, forming themselves into a double file many miles long. The cone of a volcano appeared over the horizon, and rose as they approached. The leaders pressed on towards its ruddy smoke plume, and unflinchingly, couple by couple, the whole multitude darted into its fiery breath and vanished. So ended the career of Flying Man.